Good morning. Great to be with you again. As we start this next series of Bible studies, I want to talk about labels, especially when, as Christians, we refer to each other by our denomination, or that we're evangelical or charismatic or reformed, or things like that. Why do we need these labels? Now, that can be helpful at times, but they can also be very misleading and even confusing. In the Old Testament, names were very significant. They're more than just labels. And an example of this is in Genesis 32, where we read that Jacob is getting ready to cross the river Jabbok. And he's wrestling with God. He doesn't realize it's God, it's an angel, and he says he wrestles with God. And afterward, his name is changed to Israel, which becomes the name of his descendants. So we have then the people of Israel. And that's partly to distinguish them from other nations and groups in the areas they lived. And then we have the example of Moses in the desert after he was exiled from Egypt. And he encounters God in a burning bush, and he asks, "What's your name?" Of course, there were many gods in the region, and he's saying, who am I encountering? But God says, "I am who I am," and that's where we get the name Yahweh from. So God says, "I am who I am." In other words, I'm not one of many gods. I am the only God. And names also reveal something of the nature of the person. So the name says something of the character of the person of that name. For example, Jesus is given the name Jesus, which is Yeshua, which actually means Savior. Of course, names or labels distinguish one group from another. So people who followed Jesus were called Christians. And those who follow the teaching of Muhammad are called Muslims. There was a Facebook post recently. There's some stupid things put on Facebook, but anyway. And the person asked the question, was Jesus a Christian? Well, the simple answer is no. Jesus was Jewish. The other question put, it was more a statement. Jesus didn't start the Christian faith. Well, of course he didn't. Neither did Paul start the Christian faith. God did, through the resurrection of the living Christ. So where did the term Christian come from? Well, you find in Acts 11:26, the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. At the time, it was a term of derision or ridicule, meaning an insult, meaning little Christs. These are little messiahs running around. But the early disciples found it appropriate, and it became the common term for the followers of Jesus. And that's what they original were known as, people of the way, or followers of Jesus. It was faith. Their faith was that Jesus was the Messiah, and that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, we receive forgiveness and salvation. So why labels? So why do we have labels? Shouldn't the term Christian be clear enough to identify what that person believes? Well, probably 2,000 years ago it might have. But today it can be confusing. There are so many people who claim to be Christian, so many groups that claim to be Christian, but we all know that they're not what they claim to be. As the Christian church developed and changed, divisions occurred, and so there were added labels. That was happening already in the time of Jesus. There were groups in the area that claimed that they were preparing for the Messiah. But immediately after Jesus' ascension, there were splinter groups. So the term was developed to distinguish between one genuine Christian group and another. This was already happening during Paul's ministry. We find in 1 Corinthians 3, Paul addresses this issue, and he says, "You are still worldly, for since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For where one says, I follow Paul and I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? Who after all is Apollos? And who is Paul? Only servants through whom you can believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task." Now, some of our sessions will overlap with David's last series when he talked about the history of the church and how some of these divisions and schisms arrived. So one can understand how non-religious people in our society get very confused when there are so many churches or groups that call themselves Christian but differ in their beliefs and practices, not just in a small way, but some significantly. Even more disturbing is when we see some of these groups fighting each other. And the most well-known and referred to situation was between the Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. And we ask, how can any Christian group justify violence against any other group, let alone those who claim to follow Jesus? Very few people seem to know that even during that conflict, there were in Ireland Protestants and Catholic Christians who opposed the conflict and were making all kinds of events and opportunities to get together. But the political undertone or overtones of the situation dominated the religious scene. Over the years, we've seen some of these terms become very popular, like born again. It became very popular in America for politicians in a few decades ago to be known as born again. The term Pentecostal, charismatic, conservative, progressive. For centuries, most of the common distinctions were between Catholic and Protestant, and again David looked at that in his earlier series. Although there was the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, that was some theological but mostly geographical and political differences there. But since the Reformation, we've seen the Protestant church splinter into many factions. I should add there, though, that there were splinter groups even before the Reformation. So there was the Anabaptists, and there was particular groups that distinguished themselves from the Roman Catholic Church. Some of the denominations that came out after the Reformation were more nationally based and differ more in organizational and governance than theology. So Some of the examples: in Germany with Martin Luther, we had the Lutheran Church. The English Reformation was triggered by Henry VIII and his issue, which wasn't purely theological, it was about power. But that was in a context where a Reformation was underway. So then there you have the English, the Anglican Church. So you also had the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the Reformed Church in places like the Netherlands. The Uniting Church came about as people recognised that many Australian towns had three Protestant churches, sometimes on three corners of an intersection. Excuse me. Each had struggling congregations, but preaching basically the same gospel. So people were asking the question, why do we have three different things? So you had the Presbyterians, which had a Scottish heritage, the Methodists, which had an English heritage, and the Congregationalists were like independent. But basically, they were on about the same thing. So the Uniting Church started to look at union as early as 1900. It took them a long time to come about. A lot of these some of these denominations, or from the Uniting Church, they discovered that their difference was not primarily theological, but governance. It was just the way they structured themselves, and some of the labels they called. So the Presbyterians, the head of the Presbyterian Church was the moderator. In the Methodist Church, there was the bishop. So, but their roles were very similar. There's been a significant decline in recent decades of people's denominational loyalties. So people have started to recognize that labels aren't that significant, that it's what's behind the label. And just because churches in different towns have different labels, the people realize that really they're on about basically the same thing. You often find in many country towns in Australia, particularly of my experience in Western Australia. So you have a country church, and Merredin's an example of this, but in other places you see it. You have a group of people that meet faithfully to worship, but they come from a wide variety of Christian backgrounds. I remember my first congregation in Denmark. We had there was in the town there was the Catholics, the Anglicans, and the Uniting Church. In the Uniting Church we had Lutherans, Baptists, Church of Christ, Pentecostals, Charismatics, and because they just wanted to go to somewhere that was what they would consider free or reformed. Sadly, over a while, they developed other churches, but it showed that for many years people could worship together, even having different background labels. What they were concerned about is not the label on the church, but the character and core beliefs of the congregation. The rise of many independent churches is an indication that denominational labels have become irrelevant. Other labels, however, have remained and become equally as divisive. Churches and individual Christians call themselves or identify as evangelical or Pentecostal or Bible believing. Many Christians in America, as we mentioned, declare themselves as born again and spirit filled. A term common in use today is conservative. The label seems to distinguish distinguish them from other maybe not so genuine Christians, but particularly what is known as the progressives. It's sad that it's sad and concerning that these labels have become politicized. So conservative Christians become right wing. Liberal or progressive Christians are labeled left wing. It seems too many people view their religion from a political perspective, rather than viewing politics from a spiritual or biblical perspective. I want to ask you to think about that later and talk about it. What does that mean? It's about looking at a situation in our world, a political situation, and saying, what is God's view of this? What's God saying to us about the situation, about immigration, about the conflict in the Middle East, rather than saying, allowing politics to tell us what our religious views should be. I get frustrated with the labels that we have. I'm considered evangelical. Some people have called me fundamentalist. In some circles, I'm even considered liberal. I'm not conservative enough. So, why the labels? Are they helpful? What can we do about it? Is there an alternative? Well, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for listening. Have a great week. Now I want to invite you to spend a few minutes discussing the following questions. How do you feel about Christian labels? Are they necessary? Why or why not? Are they helpful? If someone asked you, what kind of a Christian are you? What would be your response, and why would you respond like that? How do you respond to or feel about the term right-wing Christian? I don't believe I'm a right-wing Christian politically. I'm closer to being a socialist, but a conservative Christian. That confuses people. How do you feel about the church and the Christian faith becoming politicized? I hope you find this helpful. May God bless you, and have a great week.